Okay, so I'm going to be reviewing the claim that mandatory minimum sentencing in the United States for drug offenses is unnecessary. And then I will be reviewing the claims that the mandatory minimum discriminates against minority groups, that it shifts power to the prosecutor disproportionately against defendants of color minorities, and it shifts basis or bias in trials. So in the first claim against discriminating minority groups, there wasn't much in this claim that says anything about discrimination. It mainly talked about the historical facts. My advocate said at one point that mandatory minimums are from Tough on Crimes Act from the 80s and the 90s, and partly the reason why prisons are so full these days. And 1 out of 100 adults are locked up. Also, that has no statistics, mind that there were no citations. So the only thing that was mentioned about discrimination, my advocate wrote that a one-off to quote example is that those who use, sell, or produce drugs that are often used by African Americans are often given harsher penalties than those who deal drugs that are often used by white population. This in turn greatly contributes to the high incarceration rates of African Americans. I don't know how mandatory minimum sentences has to go into that. Mandatory minimum sentences are what they say. It's a mandatory minimum. So whether or not the African Americans are given harsher penalization, that's based off the prosecutor and what he adds on top of that, not in the case of that. So instead of an African American getting 7 years and a white person getting 5 years, an African American might get 7 years and a white person might get community service just to learn from something. So that mandatory minimum raises that. The second claim was that mandatory minimums shift power to the prosecutors who file charges with those mandatory minimum disproportionately against. He said that if people know that they're guilty, they will face a lot of prison time as punishment because mandatory minimums exist. That happens regardless if it exists or not. And then they end up using this offer incentive to rat out the dealers for plea bargain. Whether or not you think that you're guilty or not, that all depends on if you are that, not depend on mandatory minimums. And he also states that the terrifying thing happened if an advocate takes out their Sixth Amendment right, which is speedy public trial, the right to know your accusers, and the right to an impartial jury, which I think would be great if you think you are innocent or guilty or not. But that's not really mandatory minimum. He also says that judges are forced to give harsh sentences to criminals who believe they are overkill. Again, there's no statistic on that of how many are given. And the third one is mandatory minimums shift bias in trials. Again, with the Sixth Amendment, you have an impartial jury, so there probably wouldn't be any bias if it was truly impartial. And then he gives this story about a woman named Darlene Eccles, who said that she had a house and her brother was using drugs, and the government offered her a plea deal of 10 years. Whether or not they didn't say if that was a mandatory minimum of that or not, but she refused to help. And then after the trial, the jury convicted her of a lesser charge that carried no mandatory minimums. So whether or not mandatory minimums should bias in a trial or not, that wouldn't happen because it's not a partial jury. Another thing that he said was, after that, the judge agreed and calculated her sentence ranging from the federal sentence, which contradicts his second claim where judges are forced to give harsh and sentences criminals who believe themselves to be overkill. Well, this judge right here in the story is giving someone a sentence of 19 years and 7 months. That's overkill with no mandatory minimum. So that kind of contradicts each other. And overall, maybe if there was a mandatory minimum, the judge could have gone to that and said, done that, but that's assertion, hypothetical situation, so something like that. So to say that mandatory minimum sentencing in the United States for drug offenses is unnecessary, maybe it could be lowered, but it is somewhat necessary. Thank you.
All right, well, the proposition, the secondary points are labeled pretty well. On the first point, you're challenging the issue of whether or not there is some discrimination involved in this process. That's a reasonable point, but you don't give us any reason to believe that it's not discriminatory. And the advocate's information about the ratios at which people are sentenced seems to be a pretty strong indicator of that. If we're talking about reasoning by sign, you provide no countersigns or other reason to believe something different. So your argument here is at best a press on the advocate's reasoning without actually offering any grounds to support a different belief. I think that's a little bit problematic. You kind of recap some of the information and the evidence that the advocate presents there, and then you offer us an argument that suggests that the penalties are proportional or that they're problematic in some way. That's what the advocate's saying. So I'm not exactly sure that you get much from all of the conversation that you had on that first point. On the argument about plea bargaining, I'm kind of also baffled. There's a lot of discussion here. There's a kind of a hypothetical that you present, and in the long run, is your argument that this sort of pressure provides us a benefit because it either reduces costs by plea bargaining or it increases our ability to prosecute crime because we get deals where people turn on one another? I don't know what your point here on this was. It seemed like it was, they said something, so you had to say something back, and what you said back was pretty abstract, and it doesn't really seem to me to deny the advocate's point on this. I also noticed that there's not any evidence that's being used by you to support your positions. There's occasional references to the lack of evidence that the advocate presents, but you don't have any evidence on your own to support these particular conclusions. The analysis that you have of the case on the third point, where you're talking about the whatever her name was, Darlene Eppert or Edits, I can't quite remember what her name was, and you say that the jury convicted her of a lesser crime, but the judge then imposed a sentence that was greater. I guess your argument here is that this was not an example of mandatory minimums, and so it doesn't really fit. That's perfectly fine. I do think that was that the evidence is that what the advocate's information said? And they've simply misused this example, or did you discover this information? I don't know where this data came from, and I think that that's a little bit problematic also. So I kind of got the feeling that there's an attempt to analyze some of these arguments, that the analysis is not always very complete. There's no evidence that supports the position that you're taking, and mostly you kind of press the lack of evidence on the advocate's side without coming to grips with the testimony of the experts that the advocate cited. All right, thank you.